So let's start with some of the more accessible words from the field guide. For a book filled with objective descriptions, these are some fairly subjective ones. In the past decade, there has been a tremendous increase in interest in the natural world. We have come to realize that we are part of a much larger sphere of life and that we share this fragile planet with a diversity of other forms. We are part of a much larger sphere of life, and we share this fragile planet with a diversity of other forms. For those of you thinking about the workshops, this is the one for next week. This reading will come back up. Now, I've always struggled with field guides. I find them frustrating. Every once in a while I buy one with great intention and I take it home and I open it up, I get through the lovely introduction and then I hit the science. You see, with field guides, there's something about them and the way they are laid out that is hard for me to grasp. These two sentences help to introduce the reason for the guide, namely the semi-scientific enjoyment of nature for the non-expert, but then the language evolves, like we heard, into exacting categories and precise objective language about stems and leaves and habitats. Now, I personally have always been more comfortable with poetry and music and the layperson's essay about the grove of trees or the beautiful sunset, or a story in which the natural world appears as a sort of character in the background. And this probably isn't surprising to any of you, given my job and my hobbies. But for Lent this year, I am in fact taking on the field guide to North American wildflowers, Eastern region. Because what I have learned over the past couple months in my preparation for the sermon series and the nature workshops and in studying for a graduate course in environmental policy that I'm also taking, what I have learned is that to really understand the earth, you need both the poetic and the prosaic, both the subjective and the objective, both art and science. My grandfather used to pause to listen to a bird or examine footprints, fur or scat on the ground, and then proceed to tell me what creature sang the song or left the signs on their way around the world. Did anyone else have a grandfather like that? Or a grandmother? No. It's okay, it's intimidating. Now, my brother does this too. And the two of them are probably the people in my life that I think of as being closest to the natural world. But with a few exceptions, I cannot do what they do. And I find it to be a detriment, a barrier toward understanding the lessons of nature. After all, knowing the earth does mean being able to observe, like Celia Thaxter does in her poem. My spirit leaps to the light on the wings of its hope newborn, and I follow your radiant light through the golden halls of morn. And things like that. Connecting to emotion and abstraction, how nature makes us feel. And this is what many of us already do. It's what many of us are most comfortable with. But knowing the earth also means observing particulars, like Thaxter does in her garden, meticulously measuring, mapping, and tracking, not just the garden itself, but the ecosystem of Appledore Island where she lived, knowing when it is healthy and when it is in distress. Over the course of time, Richard Premack tells us, Henry David Thoreau extracted information on flowering times from his field notes and journals on sheets of surveyor's paper. He was a surveyor, as you may recall, the act of a scientist. However, Premack goes on, Thoreau was also preoccupied with the connections among beauty, philosophy, and the natural rhythms of the season. He wanted to see as deeply as possible into nature, not through it or beyond it. He wanted to see as deeply as possible into nature, not through it or beyond it. Now, this last part of Premac's description sounds a lot like the Thoreau we know, the philosopher and writer who played flute to the fish. But he was a scientist as well, doing a good enough job that, as I've mentioned, he ended up forming a solid baseline of observations that can now be used to measure global warming in metrowatts. When it comes to learning from nature, it is worthwhile to be like both sides of Thaxter and Thoreau. In every relationship, in fact, to really know someone else means to take the time to study and understand. To understand them, not just ourselves through them. In the first sermon of this series, we talked about our pets. It is so easy to project on our pets, to give them our own human emotions and motivations. And when we treat nature this way as merely an extension of our own selves, free from the facts of their independent existence, we lose something. Thaxter knew that. Thoreau knew that. And intuitively, we know this too, though we don't always act like we know. Now, of course, the good news is that we can and do live a life of both art and science. Both art and science. We can and do appeal to poetry and faith while learning more about how creation functions every single day. We do it, in fact, much of the time without giving it any thought. In addition to gardening and camping, Thaxter and Thoreau's things, cooking is both an art and a science. Painters, many of them, know the chemical composition of their paints, just as potters know their soil, and weavers and knitters know about the nature of sheep and wool. We live in a world where this dialogue is ongoing. The challenge, though, is to take that extra step. The challenge is to take that extra step and be mindful of the way we bring these things into conversation. Mindful of how we take the creative moment of our hearts and open ourselves to the hard facts of the environment around us. So the question for each of us, at the end of this series, is how do we open up another avenue in the conversation between nature and humanity? How do we personally do this? How do we open up another avenue in the conversation between nature and humanity? Now, for me, and for now, it means figuring out how to read that field guide. But for others, it may be something else. For someone who works with objective facts every day, which is to say the more scientifically minded among us, it may be writing or painting or even coming to church. Jesus urges us in Matthew to consider the birds of the air and the flowers of the field. He often talks like that. We know this. For him, as for many of us, a close observation of nature reveals many things, including hints to whatever in this world may be considered transcendent, holy, or divine. For someone like Jesus, the act of observation is worshipful. Worshipful. And worship in all of its forms is a creative act, an art that we participate in, an attempt to tell the story of life as it is filtered through our own particular experiences of it. Now, during the pandemic, when we worshipped outside in the garden, or took communion at the front doors of the sanctuary, as many of us did, even in the darkest days. Our experience of nature was direct and explicit. It was direct and explicit because we were outside. Now we are trying out some other things, like Sabbath walks, observing as Jesus and the prophets did, as the transcendentalists did, and as they and scientists still do, in communion and conversation with nature and the divine. Jacob Trapp, a poet and a Unitarian Universalist minister, wrote a communion meditation that gets at this sense of close observation, of joining art and science, of the close connection between people, faith, and the world. Simply to be, he wrote, and to let things be as they speak wordlessly from the mystery of who they are. Simply to say a silent yes to the hillside flowers, to the trees we walk under. To pass from one person to another a morsel of bread and answering yes. This is the simplest, the quietest of sacraments. So today, this morning, let's take a moment to simply be and let things be as they speak wordlessly. To consider those flowers and the trees we walk under, to observe the world objectively and subjectively and be moved by it to greater connection and understanding. Now let's take a moment of silent prayer.